What happens when a country decides it has had enough? Not just enough of watching its cities burn, not just enough of burying its soldiers, but enough of watching the exact weapons used to kill its people being shipped across a massive inland sea, right under the noses of the entire world, while the international community looks the other way and pretends nothing is happening? On July 25th, 2026, Ukraine answered that question in the most dramatic fashion possible. It fired long-range drones into the Caspian Sea, striking vessels that were part of the weapons pipeline between Iran and Russia, and in doing so, it didn't just escalate a war, it collapsed the wall separating two different conflicts into one. What you are watching right now is not just a military escalation, it is a fundamental redrawing of the geopolitical map. Two wars have just merged, and Iran, by choosing to challenge Ukraine's right to defend itself, may have just made the biggest strategic miscalculation of this entire era of global conflict. Let's establish exactly what happened. On July 25th and 26, 2026, Ukrainian forces conducted long-range strikes on vessels in the Caspian Sea. Ukraine struck a Russian warship and vessels transporting Iranian-linked military cargo. President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed the strikes, saying Ukraine hit ships used in military cargo shipments involving Iran, as well as a warship. Now, here's what Iran said. Iran's foreign ministry summoned Ukraine's chargé d'affaires in Tehran, condemning the incident as aggression against one of its commercial ships, and claimed the attack killed one sailor and injured several others. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, took to social media in a fury, branding the strikes a violation of the United Nations Charter and claiming Israel had provoked Ukraine to pull Europe into a wider war. But let's be clear about something. That framing, the Israel made them do it excuse, is exactly the kind of diplomatic sleight of hand that Tehran has been running for years. It's the regime deflecting responsibility for consequences that have been years in the making. Here's what the evidence actually shows. Ukraine asserted that both vessels had left Iran for a Russian port, and the U.S. National Security Council had previously warned of deepening military cooperation between Iran and Russia, saying any transfer of Iranian ballistic missiles to Russia would represent a dramatic escalation. And those Shahed drones, the ones that have been slamming into Ukrainian apartment buildings, power stations, and hospitals, since 2022, they don't materialize out of thin air. They travel from Iranian factories onto ships across the Caspian Sea and into Russian hands. The route is documented, the ships are tracked, and the targets were known. Ukraine's campaign against Russian energy infrastructure had already expanded sharply, with Russian refineries struck at least 194 times from January to early July 2026. Ukraine was already operating in a totally different strategic gear than the world realized. The Caspian strike wasn't a reckless gamble. It was a calculated, intelligence-driven operation against a supply chain that had been bleeding Ukrainian lives for years. Now ask yourself, why the Caspian? Why not just continue hitting Russian targets on Russian soil? The answer is that Ukraine has been escalating its targeting logic systematically. Shadow Fleet ships have become a priority because they represent the invisible supply chain of the war. Destroy the weapons before they even reach Russian territory. And you don't just prevent one strike, you potentially prevent dozens. As international pressure mounted on Iran's southern maritime routes, the Caspian Sea had evolved into a vital trade corridor linking Iran with Russia, Central Asia, and broader markets toward China. For Iran, the Caspian wasn't just a trade route, it was one of the last. Economic arteries still flowing while everything else was being choked off. Ukraine's strike hit Iran not just militarily, but economically. And the regime in Tehran felt it in ways far beyond the burning hulls of two cargo ships. The intelligence that made this possible is worth understanding. Ukraine is part of the War and Sanctions Project, a massive, continuously updated database of sanctioned and targeted ships, combining open-source data, satellite imagery, and partner intelligence. Both struck vessels were already in that database, already flagged, already monitored. When Finnish-backed synthetic aperture radar capability was combined with drone technology of this range, Ukraine turned the entire Caspian into a target zone. And the drones used, the Liu-T, are capable of flying over 1,000 kilometers, carrying warheads of up to 75 kilograms with AI-assisted navigation that resists electronic warfare jamming. This was not improvised. This was the result of years of methodical military development pointing toward a single moment. Let's talk about why Iran is so furious. Not the diplomatic fury, not the carefully worded social media posts from a foreign minister trying to look strong in front of his domestic audience. The real fury, the kind that comes from an economic reality so brutal that a burning cargo ship in the Caspian Sea isn't just an insult, it is a genuine material wound to a regime that is already bleeding out from a dozen directions at once. Because when you understand just how desperate Iran's economic situation actually is right now in the summer of 2026, you start to understand why Araghchi's threats carry a different weight than usual. This isn't posturing from a position of strength. This is a cornered regime reacting to a strike that hit it exactly where it cannot afford to be hit. Let's go back to the beginning of this year to understand how we got here. After the United States and Israel began attacking Iran on February 28, 2026, Iran retaliated by threatening and attacking vessels attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz. As a result, insurance became unavailable or prohibitively expensive for vessels transiting the strait, and the waterway became effectively closed. Iran continued its own crude oil exports of about 2 million barrels per day until the United States began a full blockade on April 13, 2026. Think about what that means in concrete terms. Iran's primary economic engine, oil, was first strangled by a war it helped start and then cut off almost entirely by a U.S. naval blockade. During the previous blockade, imposed on April 13th and lasting a little over 2 months, Iranian authorities attested to near zero crude exports. A prolonged second blockade now risks further reducing Iran's export revenues and piling pressure on Karg Island, through which about 90% of Iran's oil exports flow. The numbers are staggering in their severity. When roughly 90% of your oil export infrastructure is under threat, and the primary maritime route through which you sell that oil is effectively controlled by your enemy's navy, you are not operating from a position of strategic confidence. You are surviving, and barely. Iran's government has been facing increasingly tough choices, including a potential fuel price hike amid high social and economic discontent, as the U.S. military enforces a naval blockade of the country's southern ports for a second time. That is the domestic reality inside Iran right now. A population already under years of sanctions pressure, now staring down fuel price increases, a cratered currency, and a war that their government started but cannot finish cleanly. Iran's Ministry of Petroleum confirmed that the country had sold just $11.5 billion worth of crude oil during the entire war period, with $6.5 billion of that coming during a temporarily suspended memorandum of understanding with the United States, and this combined total accounted for only 60% of the oil. Revenue target set in this year's national budget. Read that again. Iran couldn't even hit 60% of its own projected oil revenue target during a period of maximum effort. The gap between what the regime needs and what it is actually generating is enormous, and that gap is being paid for in social pressure, economic instability, and the very real risk of internal unrest that every authoritarian government fears above all else. This is precisely where the Caspian route to Russia became so strategically critical for Tehran. With Hormuz effectively closed or militarized, with Gulf trade, relationships collapsed because Iran was actively targeting Gulf neighbors with drones and missiles, and with Chinese non-oil trade volumes collapsing. The passage of weapons and goods across the Caspian represented one of the few remaining commercial corridors Iran could actually use. Iranian officials maintained that the targeted ships were strictly commercial, framing Ukraine's attack as a direct threat to a crucial economic artery. And in a narrow sense, they weren't entirely wrong about the economic importance. They were just lying about the cargo, because the ships weren't carrying commercial goods in the traditional sense. They were carrying weapons, drones, missile components, the very instruments of death that have been raining down on Ukrainian cities since 2022. The idea that Ukraine should quietly accept this supply chain continuing to operate simply because the ships flew certain flags or claimed civilian status is an argument that strains credibility beyond its breaking point. Now look at what Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha said directly to his Iranian counterpart in a phone call on July 28th. Sybiha emphasized the necessity to refrain from any escalatory steps, as well as to end all support for Russia's war against Ukraine. That's Ukraine simultaneously warning Iran and demanding a policy change in the same sentence. It is a remarkably confident posture for a country that has been under relentless bombardment for years. And it tells you something important. Ukraine believes it currently holds diplomatic leverage that it didn't have before. Zelensky also made something else very clear in his July 25th evening address to the Ukrainian people. He alleged that Russia had been providing Iran with satellite imagery to assist in planning and assessing military strikes in the Middle East, including surveillance of Gulf states and U.S. military facilities. Russian satellites observed air bases in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait between July 19th and July 20th alone. This is the intelligence bombshell buried inside the Caspian story that most people missed. Russia and Iran aren't just sharing weapons, they're sharing targeting data. Russia is actively helping Iran hit American bases. That makes the Iran-Russia axis not just a problem for Ukraine, it makes it a direct threat to the United States military. And Zelensky knew exactly who he was talking to when he said it. Here is the question that every serious analyst, every defense ministry, and every intelligence agency in Europe is asking right now in the final days of July 2026. Can Iran actually hit Ukraine? Not rhetorically, not as a diplomatic bluff, but physically, kinetically. Can the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps load a ballistic missile onto a launch pad somewhere in northwestern Iran and put a warhead into Kiev? Because if the answer is yes, then what started as a drone war between Russia and Ukraine just became something categorically different, something that pulls in American air defenses, NATO treaty obligations, and the entire architecture of Western military deterrence into a conflict that was already consuming enormous global resources. And the answer, after going through the technical assessments published by Defense Express, UA News, and multiple open-source military analysts over the past week, is, uncomfortably, yes, theoretically. And that theoretical possibility is exactly what is driving the current panic in Ukrainian monitoring channels and the urgency behind Zelensky's Washington visit. Let's go through the hardware. Iran possesses a significant arsenal of medium-range ballistic missiles, some of which are potentially capable of reaching Ukrainian territory if launched from Iranian soil. According to analysts, the Khorramshahr missile may pose the greatest threat, while missiles such as the Ghadir, Imad, and Sejil carry estimated ranges of approximately 2,000 kilometers. Now, the distance from Iran's northwestern border to Kiev sits at roughly 700 to 2,000 kilometers, depending on the launch point and trajectory. Distances from western Iran to eastern Ukraine measure roughly 1,700 to 2,000 kilometers, placing key Ukrainian cities theoretically within reach. Pro-Iranian outlets circulated maps referencing systems such as the Khorramshahr 4. The Khorramshahr series is particularly concerning because analysts believe its extended range variants can push beyond 3,000 kilometers, trading warhead mass for additional distance. That means even with a reduced payload, it carries enough destructive force to cause mass casualties if it hits a populated urban area. And Ukraine's air defense system, already chronically stretched by years of Russian missile and drone barrages, is not configured to intercept ballistic threats at that range, an altitude the way Israel's layered defense architecture is. Ukraine faces the Iranian ballistic missile threat without the defenses its allies gave Israel. Ukrainian monitoring channels that help track Russian drones and missiles carried information that Iran might attack Ukraine with ballistic missiles, though a ballistic strike on Ukraine has not been officially confirmed. That gap, the absence of the kind of multi-layered ballistic missile defense that Israel received from the United States and its allies, is one of the most dangerous vulnerabilities Ukraine currently carries. The Patriot system remains the only platform in Ukraine's inventory genuinely capable of intercepting ballistic missiles, and Ukraine has been running dangerously low on Patriot interceptors for months, a fact that Zelensky has been raising with every Western leader he meets. The prospect of deeper Iranian support for Russia is especially serious because Ukraine already faces an acute shortage of air defense interceptors. During Zelensky's July 28th meeting with Trump in Washington, the two discussed granting Ukraine licenses to produce Patriot missile interceptors. That single data point, a sitting American president sitting across from a Ukrainian president in the Oval Office on July the 28th, specifically discussing Patriot interceptor production licenses, tells you everything about the severity of the ballistic missile problem Ukraine is now facing from two directions simultaneously. But now here is where the strategic picture gets genuinely fascinating, because what Iran is actually considering doing and what it is likely to do are two very different things. A direct Iranian ballistic missile strike on Ukraine remains the least likely scenario, according to security. And military studies expert Omar Asher at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, even if one occurred, it would probably be limited and largely symbolic, since Iran lacks the capacity to inflict more damage on Ukraine than Russia already does. Asher said Tehran generally prefers asymmetric, indirect, and deniable action. The more probable pathways for Iranian retaliation, according to analysts, involve informational and diplomatic escalation, and, far more dangerously, deeper technical cooperation with Russia. This means not just sending more drones, but helping Russia improve its drone technology, refine its strike coordination, and potentially sharing ballistic missile expertise that could dramatically upgrade what Russia is already firing at Ukrainian cities. That is a threat multiplier that no amount of diplomatic language can paper over. And yet, here's what nobody is saying loudly enough. The New York Times, citing sources, reported that Iran considered launching a ballistic missile equipped with a small warhead to attack a Ukrainian port. However, the situation was reportedly diffused through diplomatic efforts, at least temporarily. Iranian officials said they hoped the confrontation would end with a retaliatory strike from Iran, while Western officials warned it was difficult to predict how Ukraine would respond. Read that carefully. Iran was actively planning a ballistic missile strike on a Ukrainian port. The plan existed. It was discussed at the regime level. It was only pulled back, at least for now, through diplomatic back-channeling. That is not a bluff. That is a regime that came within a decision of firing the shot that would formally merge. On July 28th, Zelensky met Trump privately in the Oval Office. The whirlwind visit offered Zelensky a chance to shore up U.S. military support for Ukraine when relations are warmer than they have been in months. The Senate voted to advance the Lindsey O. Graham sanctioning. Russia and Iran. Act of 2026 by an overwhelming 86 to 12 majority on the evening of July 28th, following the late senator's funeral service. The updated bill includes sanctions against Iran. In a single day in Washington, Ukraine secured a Patriot production discussion, a bipartisan E. We are standing at one of those rare moments in modern history where the decisions made inside a handful of government buildings in Tehran, Kiev, Moscow, and Washington over the next few weeks will determine the trajectory of global security for years to come. That is not hyperbole. That is the sober, analytical conclusion you reach when you map out what has happened since July 25th, 2026, and follow every thread to where it logically leads. Two wars that were always connected by weapons, by money, by satellite imagery, and by shared strategic interests have now been formally pulled into the same orbit by Ukrainian drones burning holes through Iranian cargo ships in the Caspian Sea. The question is no longer whether these conflicts are linked. That argument is over. The question now is how violently that linkage expresses itself in the weeks ahead, and whether the major players have enough strategic discipline to prevent a regional catastrophe from becoming a genuinely global one. Start with Iran, because Iran's next move is the most consequential variable in this entire equation. The regime is facing a pressure matrix unlike anything it has experienced in decades. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed since the United States began a full blockade on April 13, 2026, following U.S. and Israeli military operations against Iran that began on February 28, 2026. The near-total closure of the strategic waterway, disruptions in the Red Sea linked to Iran-aligned groups in Ukraine now striking an Iranian-linked vessel in the Caspian Sea have all broadened the conflict's economic implications, raising serious concerns over Iran's trade, energy exports, and regional shipping routes. Every economic corridor Iran relied upon is now either closed, militarized, or, as of July 25th, actively dangerous. The regime cannot afford to look weak domestically. It cannot absorb the humiliation of a country it has been indirectly attacking for 3 years, suddenly striking its own ships and facing zero consequences. And yet, it also cannot afford the escalation that a direct ballistic missile strike on Ukrainian territory would trigger. That is the trap Iran built for itself by choosing to arm Russia in the first place. Analysts assess that the most likely form of Iranian retaliation is not a dramatic ballistic strike, but a deepening of technical military cooperation with Russia, including improvements to drone technology, production inputs, strike coordination, and potentially ballistic missile expertise sharing. That scenario is in many ways more dangerous than a single missile strike, because it is harder to deter, harder to attribute, and harder to respond to with a proportionate counteraction. If Iran quietly helps Russia make its Shahed drone swarms more accurate, more resistant to jamming, and more lethal, the immediate victims are Ukrainian civilians, not a political target that generates international headlines, but apartment buildings and power grids and hospital generators going dark in winter. The war gets worse without ever producing the clean escalatory event that forces the international community to respond decisively. That slow bleed is actually Iran's most effective weapon right now, and the reason why Ukraine's argument that the two conflicts must be treated as one is not just strategically convenient for Kiev, but genuinely accurate as a matter of military reality. Now look at Russia's position, because Moscow is watching all of this with a calculation that is entirely its own. Russia benefits from the chaos. Every hour that American strategic attention is split between the Pacific, the Persian Gulf, and Eastern Europe is an hour that Russian forces can grind forward in Ukraine's east without facing the full weight of Western resolve. Zelensky accused Russia of providing Iran with satellite imagery of Gulf states and U.S. military facilities to assist Iranian strikes, including surveillance of 4 air bases in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait between July the 19th and July 20th alone. Russia is not a passive beneficiary of the Iran-U.S. conflict. It is an active participant, feeding targeting data to a regime that is firing at American bases. That is a direct act of aggression against the United States military, conducted through a proxy with plausible deniability layered on top. And the fact that this information is now in the hands of the Trump administration, delivered personally by Zelensky during his July 28th White House visit, changes the diplomatic calculus in ways that are still unfolding. Following the Senate's 86-12 vote to advance the Lindsey Graham Sanctioning Russia and Iran Act of 2026, Zelensky said he was very thankful for the strong signal of support for Ukraine. An 86-12 bipartisan majority in a bitterly divided American Senate is not a routine procedural vote. That is a signal of genuine political consensus, that Russia and Iran are being viewed increasingly as two faces of the same threat. The legislation that bears Senator Graham's name passed on the very day of his funeral, and the very day Zelensky sat in the Oval Office, is the kind of historical symmetry that reminds you how pivotal this particular moment actually is. Ukraine didn't just strike Iranian ships in the Caspian, it crystallized a political argument that it has been trying to make for years, that its war is the West's war, that its enemy is the West's enemy, and that the weapons being used against it are part of a global network of authoritarian cooperation that threatens every democratic nation on Earth. Zelensky told reporters that Ukraine had drones capable of destroying Iranian and Russian-built drones, but that the real problem remained anti-ballistic systems and interceptors. He said the priority was clear: anti-ballistic defense and strategic cooperation with America. That statement captures the entire strategic situation in 2 sentences. Ukraine can fight the drone war. It has demonstrated that capability conclusively, including by reaching across 1,000 kilometers of open water to strike the Shadow Fleet inside the Caspian. What Ukraine cannot do alone is defend against the ballistic missile threat, the threat that Iran just reminded the world it is capable of posing, and the threat that Russia has been escalating for months. The convergence of those 2 ballistic missile arsenals operating in coordination with shared satellite intelligence and deepening technical cooperation represents the most dangerous military development in the European theater since the war began. So where does this end? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not being straight with you. What we do know is that Iran made a serious miscalculation when it decided to challenge Ukraine's right to defend itself by threatening retaliation for strikes against weapons ships. It handed Ukraine a diplomatic gift, a military justification, and a geopolitical narrative that now runs straight through the halls of the United States Senate. The Caspian is no longer a safe corridor, the Shadow Fleet is no longer invisible, and the idea that Iran can arm Russia without consequence, without Ukrainian drones finding those ships wherever they sail, has been permanently shattered. Iran challenged Ukraine. It called Ukraine a freeloader. It threatened to make the strikes go unanswered. And Ukraine's answer was to fly straight to Washington, brief the most powerful government on Earth, and walk out with a Patriot production deal and an 86-vote Senate majority. If that is what losing looks like, one can only imagine what winning means for Kyiv. The world changed on July 25th, 2026. Most people haven't fully understood that yet. But the regimes in Tehran, Moscow, and the generals studying maps in European NATO capitals, they understand it perfectly. The only question left is whether the decisions made in the coming days will contain this fire or let it spread into something none of us are prepared for. Stay informed. Stay watching, because this story is far from over.